Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a revisited look back at the BlackBerry KEYone here in 2025. This is a smartphone that debuted in 2017. Time really does fly, but part of the reason why I wanted to revisit this, aside from it being one of the last candy bar form factor BlackBerry phones made, is because there's been a growing trend of digital minimalism cropping up. And one of the devices, for example, that just came out recently is the Minimal phone that reminds me a lot of the BlackBerry KEYone and the Key 2. It has a similar touchscreen display up top, as well as a QWERTY keyboard layout down below. One difference, of course, is the Minimal phone has a e-ink screen similar to a Kindle e-reader, which perhaps is even easier on the eyes when you're reading back text compared to the more conventional IPS LCD screen of the BlackBerries, instead of being only in black and white. But also, there's a pretty large delta in terms of price. These newer minimalist style phones like the Minimal device here actually sells for around $400, and that's the discounted pre-sale amount. Not to mention alternatives like the Lite phone are all around the same cost. Actually quite expensive for a purposefully more limited phone, albeit one with a more interesting design. So it kind of got me thinking, what if you used one of these BlackBerry KEYone phones? Could you get a similar experience? It definitely seems like an interesting value proposition because you can now find the KEYone used on sites like eBay, for example, for just around $50 when shopping around. And although used, it is in fully functional condition, and it's 10 times less than one of the newer Minimal phones. And so it seems enough time has passed that maybe many folks have forgotten about the existence of the KEYone, which is why the price, again, is finally starting to come down into kind of that budget bargain territory on the used marketplace. What I will say, though, is if you're considering its slightly newer revision, which is the BlackBerry Key 2, that model, despite being 1 year newer, is significantly more expensive even when you're shopping around used, often for around $200 to $300 still to this day, which in my opinion is just a little bit too steep in terms of pricing for a model which is, again, from 2018, and not that much less compared to one of those newer Minimal phones, which is why I think the KEYone might be just a slightly better value, even though the specs, of course, will be slightly inferior. For example, it's rocking the Qualcomm Snapdragon 625 octa-core 2 GHz processor compared to the Snapdragon 660 on the Key 2. So both of these processors in the Snapdragon 600 line is not going to be flagship grade. Even back in its day, it was more of a mid-range performer. And at first, I was a little concerned because the 625, even though it's a pretty efficient chip and performed well for its time, I was worried that maybe it just wouldn't hold up quite as nicely by 2025 standards. It would feel too slow and choppy. But luckily, it seems like the software optimization has been done quite well. So everything for the most part in terms of navigation still feels a bit more fluid than I expected considering this phone's age. Now there's also two variants to keep in mind. The original silver colorway had only 3 GB of RAM, which is definitely on the lower side in this day and age, although the black colorway here, especially if you're going with the AT&T marked variant, came with 4 gigs of RAM, which I think is also helping it perform just a little bit better. And that's also compared to the Key 2, which further upgrades that to 6 GB of RAM. That being said, the overall form factor, concept, and build quality across the two versions are otherwise still going to be quite similar. Which, speaking of taking a closer look at the design, I think the KEYone and Key 2 have held up actually quite well. Interestingly, these phones were manufactured by TCL, and they were using the BlackBerry license to manufacture these, similar to an agreement they had with Palm, aka the Palm PDAs from back in the day, and likewise, TCL acquired the license to use that when they created the tiny Palm companion phone from a couple of years back as well. And similarly, they own the Alcatel brand as well, which back in the late 2010s, they created some phones also running on Windows OS as well as Android, but really all of these devices were manufactured by TCL's parent company. However, it seems like this strategy of just using different licensing agreements commercially didn't see as much of a splash as TCL wanted, and so that's why they've kind of pivoted in recent years. They're just making phones labeled as TCL now, kind of dropping all of the licensing names that they had used previously, perhaps drawing on nostalgia. But as time passes, our memory of the iconic Blackberries and Palms of yesteryear also starts to grow more distant, and so they're trying to maybe modernize things and just use their own name instead. But here's the thing, even though TCL never found critical success on their smartphone business, they're still quite well known for making good quality TVs and displays at affordable price points. And so it's never been a brand that has had poor quality in my experience. It's just they never really caught on, mainly because of the stiff competition in this particular industry. But regardless, they definitely did a very good job in terms of the hardware of the KEYone here. It still feels incredibly premium picking it up. It may not look like it when you are just glancing at the design from afar, but the frame is etched out of aluminum alloy, so it has a nice density to it. It's far from feeling cheap or flimsy, actually very tight and nicely machined. The bottom here, of course, has that iconic QWERTY keyboard layout that also has a fingerprint scanner integrated into the spacebar that's actually quite fast and accurate to unlock. The entire keyboard, by the way, is also touch sensitive, allowing you to use it for swipe gestures like a touchpad or a mouse, as well as when you're typing, you can swipe up for autocorrection support, which is also a feature carried over from the BlackBerry Passport and the BlackBerry Priv, which was really the last hardware device that the true BlackBerry from Research in Motion or RIM actually manufactured and sold back in 2015, which is really bittersweet because this 2015 phone honestly still looks extremely modern even 10 years later in 2025 from a design perspective with its waterfall curved AMOLED screens. Yes, probably not everyone's a fan of that, but definitely makes the phone look very sleek, having the same touch sensitive keyboard support and having the slighter form factor, meaning you could use it like a normal phone when consuming media or browsing the web, but then access that keyboard when you wanted to do more typing or emails, all in a surprisingly slim form factor. And it was really their first device running on the Android operating system. Just again, a bit of a shame that it was crippled by, at the time, a generation of processors, the Qualcomm Snapdragon 808, that was notorious for overheating. It wasn't really BlackBerry or RIM's fault, but unfortunately it was a generation of chips that just did not perform quite well, and so it affected the sales and the overall performance of the device that was otherwise beautiful from a hardware point of view. There was the volume rocker as well as a programmable hotkey that can be used to trigger different applications, also kind of forward thinking for its time. The bottom features the Type-C port for charging, microphone as well as loudspeaker, although unfortunately stereo speakers on the top and bottom were not available on the KEYone. And then on the other side there's just the power key. So a pretty clean overall design. And then of course above the keyboard you also had some virtual keys which are touch sensitive for going back home, multitasking, and back. Finally, above the 4.5-inch IPS LCD touchscreen, which also has a very sharp 434 pixels per inch, and that is thanks to a actually nearly 2K resolution panel on here for a smaller screen size, makes it excellent in terms of sharpness. There's also going to be the machined earpiece as well as proximity light sensor and an 8-megapixel front-facing camera. And now a closer look at this 4-row QWERTY keyboard, definitely a rarity in this day and age. For those that want the tactility of having physical buttons and keys, it's just a little bit satisfying and more accurate to tap on super quickly after you train your muscle memory compared to a touchscreen that doesn't have as much feedback when you're using it, can have more accidental mispresses, for example. Although, of course, autocorrection has improved significantly in modern software versions of keyboards as well. But still, the tactility of a BlackBerry keyboard is awesome to see. Again, as you're typing, there's going to be predictive text that are shown on screen, and you can swipe up under this particular section to pull those choices into your actual text, further improving the speed of the typing experience. And overall, I think TCL did an excellent job with this keyboard. It offers great depth and travel, pretty satisfying to press on, doesn't feel too mushy at all, with nice spacing and size, which is still comfortable to use. Now, if we did want to compare it side by side with a true BlackBerry hardware from Research in Motion, I would say it's kind of a toss-up in terms of the device that you're pairing it against. The Priv, for example, to achieve that super ridiculously slim profile, actually has less key travel, so it feels a little bit more stiff as you're pressing down, but the overall experience, I would say, it's not too far apart. And then compared to other more classic BlackBerries from back in the day, actually comes surprisingly close. Now, yes, maybe some of the true OG BlackBerries were even more satisfying, but I would say this is around 90, if not 95% as good. So kudos to TCL for making this keyboard as good as it is, despite this being their really first foray into making a phone that has a physical keyboard. Maybe my only complaint is that the texture of the keyboard is a little more shiny, as you can tell here. So it tends to be a bit more slick in texture versus the true BlackBerries of yesteryear had more of that matte finish, which further prevented any slipperiness when you're using it. But because the keys themselves are domed, it's actually not bad and still is, in my opinion, slightly more accurate compared to a, again, touchscreen keyboard if you're trying to do a lot of text entry. As for software, it is running on Android 8.0 Oreo, so obviously quite outdated by 2025 standards. But again, if you're using this like a minimal style phone, primarily just handling the basics like calling, texting, it's 4G LTE enabled, as well as maybe just a little bit of light web browsing here and there, honestly, it's still a perfectly usable experience. In fact, you can still sign in as well as install any application from the Google Play Store without too many problems. And I guess it's also one advantage compared to a true minimal style phone that just doesn't give you the capability, like on the Lite phone, to even run any of these apps. On this device, you can still take advantage of these services if you want to use them, or of course you can limit your usage if you just want to ignore them. Now, if you're used to stock Android, I would say BlackBerry's skin on top of it is also quite interesting and different. It was introduced on the BlackBerry Priv, and we see a continuation of it on the KEYone and the KEY2. For example, there's a kind of slider here on the side that you can interact with to take a look at quick notifications, such as upcoming calendar events, as well as checklist items that you want to complete using this swipe gesture that kind of takes advantage of the 2.5D curved glass of the screen. Even though the display itself is flat, the edges here just feel a little bit more rounded off as you are interacting with it. Furthermore, aside from the standard Google apps, you'll see BlackBerry's version of some of the other tools and services provided here. Many of these are more geared towards productivity. For example, their version of a Notes app, a Locker app that will hide sensitive documents behind a biometric password, a basic sound recorder app here, solid microphone quality on here. So it's clear BlackBerry/TCL put in a little bit more effort into just customizing the experience with some of these utility tools. It's not too over the top, nor is it that obtrusive, in my opinion. Now, depending on if you're picking up a carrier version of this phone, like this model with AT&T, you can also find some carrier bloat, but luckily most of these can be just disabled or uninstalled. A couple of other extras include a power center here, which is essentially their version of some battery optimization settings. Also, the multitasking animation using these tiles is a little bit playful, being a bit different again from stock Android. Universal search here also takes advantage of the excellent keyboard down below, so you're able to instantly search to find specific apps as well as notes and documents located in the phone's memory. There's even a built-in FM radio if you plug in headphones to act as the antenna, Detect by BlackBerry, which will scan the phone in terms of its files, as well as whether you've installed the latest software updates, although of course that's no longer really applicable, to gauge your security level for more enterprise customers back in the day. And last but not least, there is BlackBerry Mobile, which was kind of their iconic core service carried over from the legacy BlackBerry OS devices, but unfortunately, since BlackBerry haven't done super well in the phone space for a number of years now, some of these services are unsurprisingly getting deprecated and shut down, even on their latest KEYone and KEY2 devices, it seems. As you can tell, even though we have internet connectivity, it can't really be accessed in terms of their server connection anymore. But back in the day, this allowed you to integrate all of the types of notifications into one spot. For example, text messages, in addition to maybe social media messages, as well as emails, they would all come into that BlackBerry Messenger as one consolidated hub to give you alerts that you can then reply to in a unified spot. It was actually quite convenient for, again, those always trying to communicate and type things out using the keyboard. But yeah, unfortunately, that's one example of an app or service that's no longer functional on this older gen device. Likewise, if you have an even older BlackBerry 10 OS device, my understanding is many of the apps and services, including their App Store, have been deprecated and shut down. So something's there to keep in mind, but because this is an Android device, thankfully you still have access to the Google Play Store, which is not going away anytime soon, and you're able to further root and install other versions of launchers and apps based on your preferences. In fact, to be more specific, it looks like the end-of-life date was actually around 2019-ish, although in late 2024, so just a couple of months ago, they also shut down the enterprise version of BlackBerry Mobile, BBM. Otherwise, again, navigating around the UI, despite now juggling multiple apps there in the background, it still seems to be, again, performing a little bit more smoothly than I was expecting for the Snapdragon 625 and 4GB of RAM. Is actually holding up quite well. So if we jump into the camera here next to take a quick peek, cameras have never been the forte of BlackBerry devices. I mean, they definitely tried on the Priv to scale things up. In fact, they partnered with Schneider to use the optics and lens from them, making it a little bit sharper at around 18 megapixels, but still the software processing left room for improvement. On the KEYone, I think TCL did a pretty solid job overall. The gap compared to other phones from a similar generation has been narrowed significantly. There's HDR capture that can boost the contrast in more difficult lighting conditions, with additional settings here including built-in filter effects and kind of film simulation effects that you can play around with, tapping on mode for panorama as well as video capture and slow-mo, and there's also more exposure settings that you can actually adjust to make the image brighter versus dimmer using this manual dial, which is kind of playful. And digging into more advanced settings, you can also turn on face detection, as well as electronic image stabilization, geotagging using the built-in GPS, and also for the control mode, you can go into a more manual option, allowing you to change even the shutter speed. The autofocus can be completely manual, as well as the white balance can be controlled more easily as well using all these tabs. The images are relatively quick to snap as well. And then briefly reviewing some of the results here, again, roughly 12 megapixels, we still have a decent amount of detail, of course, compared to even more advanced software processing found on, say, Google Pixel smartphones and even newer iPhones and Samsung devices. Of course, the performance in low light conditions still has room for improvement, but all in all, it is one of the better cameras from a BlackBerry phone, especially compared to the classic OG BlackBerries. The resolution, detail, HDR have all been improved drastically, and you get more than usable enough photos, in my opinion, just for preserving your memories and also even sharing on social media, as you can tell here with some natural bokeh as well if you're shooting in a macro mode. So despite not being a camera-centric phone, I would say on here it is more than usable and a nice improvement compared to past generation BlackBerry devices. A couple of extras on BlackBerry's launcher include the ability for you to peek into any notifications directly from the home screen here, as well as, of course, BlackBerry's custom wallpapers that gives it a slightly more discreet professional look. Even icon packs can be changed on the fly. For example, within the icon packs, instead of default Android, we can choose the more nostalgic BlackBerry 10 or BlackBerry 7 OS icon packs. Let's actually try this out, and you can see this is what the icons will instead look like compared to BlackBerry version 7, definitely a nostalgic throwback. We get a better idea of the display as well, using some of these classic BlackBerry fonts or other more abstract art effects can also be picked between, and some which is reminiscent of the Priv that we saw a while back as well. By the way, some of the icons that have 3 dots underneath them also indicate that you can expand it into kind of a widget view. Just by long holding for a couple of seconds, you can pull up contextual info, like jumping into the ability to quickly reply to messages, and you can even swipe up on them to quickly jump into their corresponding widgets for quick access controls. It's actually kind of unique to BlackBerry's launcher. You can think of this as their version of something like Force Touch on some of the older iPhones, where you can actually launch into more advanced settings just by using this particular gesture that is not found in default Android. So it is actually surprisingly fun to play around with in terms of the BlackBerry launcher. In retrospect, offered something just a little bit different. Now, if we take a closer look, in fact, at this keyboard in terms of some of the common commands, if you're actually typing out a word, you can actually swipe back to delete the entire word, as well as tap here to pull it into a cursor point mode. Allows you to more clearly and easily jump between different letters to correct any spelling typos if you don't want to use the backspace. Plus, a clipboard section for copy and pasting can also be accessed. So yeah, the BlackBerry keyboard experience is actually pretty fully fledged, even here in 2025. And in darker environments, of course, the keyboard and soft keys down below are going to be fully backlit, making it easy enough to see. The phone also comes with NFC for contactless mobile payment, but if we dive a little deeper into these advanced system settings, you can also assign quick launch shortcut commands to certain keys on the keyboard. For example, long holding on A key can launch into your favorite contact, versus other keys can launch into specific applications that you're commonly accessing. Furthermore, this is where we can reassign that convenience key on the side if you wanted to quickly tap on it to jump into a specific profile, such as a meeting mode that will disable any incoming notifications versus a car mode, as well as offering support for double tap to wake the screen as well. Now, if anything, the base model coming with 32 gigs of built-in storage is definitely the one spec that I would say is starting to show its age a little bit, especially as apps start to take up more space or if you have more files locally stored on the phone. You'll get around 20 or so gigabytes free out of the box. So I would definitely recommend supplementing this using the micro SD card slot if you have more apps and media files on the phone. Now jumping into a quick demo of video playback and what the speakers sound like.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no,
Alright, so turning the volume down there, takeaway is the built-in loudspeaker quality is actually not bad. It's sufficiently loud, although it doesn't have too much bass or depth. But again, you can definitely plug in your own headphones or connect to wireless buds to improve the audio performance even more. The only thing is, again, a built-in stereo set, including the earpiece up top, would of course made it even more immersive, but it is what it is, especially if you're using it as a more minimalist style phone. You're not watching tons of movies on the device, and I think it's going to be perfectly sufficient, especially for quicker videos, podcasts, things like that. In terms of buffering, you don't have to wait too long. The antenna reception quality with both Wi-Fi as well as AT&T here in the Seattle region has been pretty stable, no disconnections, so fairly reliable from a connectivity point of view. Furthermore, this IPS LCD screen actually looks beautiful from the perspective of color and contrast, striking a nice balance between accuracy and vibrancy, again being pin sharp because of the high PPI. Text details, colors, all look actually quite satisfying on this display, despite the slightly smaller size. And to be honest, I didn't find myself really missing a larger conventional display all that much either, with the more boxy aspect ratio, kind of like an iPad for example, perhaps better suited for things like document work, as well as web browsing, reading, things like that, compared to a really narrow widescreen display being better for video consumption. So as far as video consumption is concerned, this is what that experience will be like. A little bit more letterboxing at the top and bottom, as well as obviously a portion used by the keyboard instead. But even so, I would say this is a usable enough screen size for it to still be comfortable in most cases. The same remarks are mostly echoed for web browsing as well, so taking a quick look here at The Verge, which is a pretty complex site, lots of videos and ads, but still pages are loading at a respectable rate. Maybe it's not instantaneous compared to more flagship grade processors all these years later, but still it's surprisingly keeping up not too poorly for the most part. We can actually jump into another page here just to serve as reference. Actually doing all right, especially if you're looking at some of the mobile optimized version of the pages. Now, as for some slight cons, I would say the soft keys here, although I like them functionally speaking, they are a little bit narrow in terms of their size and placement. So as you're typing, you have to be careful not to accidentally trigger it as well as when you're swiping on the display. But this is a design decision also carried over on that latest minimal phone. So I think it's still usable enough, just takes a little bit of acclimation. Here's another example of a web page, again doing a reasonable job just for reading back articles, pinch to zoom also working without too many issues. Now again, the slightly more limited RAM just means you can't open up as many background applications as well as tabs in the browser. If you're doing a lot of multitasking, things will get a little bit more sluggish and slow. But if you're limiting things to just around 3 or 4 tabs, not doing too much crazy multitasking, then it still seems to be a pretty surprisingly smooth experience considering the age of this phone. That being said, when it comes to gaming, you definitely have to keep things very casual and see a bit more dropped frames compared to more powerful modern day phones. But again, for more casual style games like Stack, for example, Crossy Road, titles like this, it can still be an okay experience. Puzzle type games, that's what I would limit this particular phone to if you have to look at those titles. But again, mostly fits with the intended target audience, I think interested in a device like this, having more of that retro feel anyways. If you are looking for a gamer phone for more AAA style titles, demanding games like Asphalt, PUBG, Minecraft, then that obviously will require a faster processor and GPU to give you a smoother experience. But again, keeping things casual, it can still do all right. And the same mostly applies when it comes to social media apps as well. Again, if you're keeping things light, for example, accessing X, aka Twitter, Messenger for typing out messages, it can do all of that without too many issues. Heavier apps though, like TikTok, which are a little bit more demanding, typically loaded with more visuals on the display, will tend to make the phone a little bit warmer. But in general use, just light web browsing, it actually still remains pretty efficient, never really thermal throttled too significantly in my experience. So having reasonable expectations, I would say it's still definitely usable, especially if you're keeping things more light. Here's an example of looking at some comics and webtoons, as well as representing what it's like if you're looking at documents as well. Reading back text and certain PDFs, you get a good idea of what it's capable of. And again, the slightly more squarish display actually makes it pretty enjoyable for scrolling and looking at content in general. Really not bad, especially with the touchpad of the keyboard here being actually quite responsive and fun to use without actually covering up the screen. So this remains an application that works quite well, even to this day. So there we have it. That's been a revisited look back at the BlackBerry KEYone here in 2025. It's kind of unfortunate that we never saw a BlackBerry Key3 TCL continue to make a revised edition with truly flagship grade specs, but at the same time, I'm surprised that even a mid-ranger from back in 2018 has held up as well as it has from a performance point of view. Everything still feels quite usable, despite it being a standard 60Hz screen, and of course the BlackBerry launcher is a little bit heavier compared to stock Android, but nonetheless it's been optimized to run pretty well. And in terms of connectivity, the device is still fully supported with 4G LTE, pretty strong antenna, as well as excellent microphone quality for making calls. Plus, again, if you really wanted to use it as a minimalist phone, getting rid of potential distractions for a more clutter-free experience, you can just slap a minimalist style launcher on it while still having the versatility of switching back if you did want to access certain tools and other apps, since it is technically a color screen and running on a full version of Android. Of course, again, certain things to keep in mind would be that the maybe security is not going to be completely up to date by 2025 standards anymore, so you may have to be a little more careful depending on what types of apps and services you're running. But again, if you're keeping things light, then it may not matter quite as much just for getting the bare essentials done, also in a very unique form factor with a comfortable keyboard, and overall still a very different looking phone even after all these years that feels surprisingly solid from a build and design point of view. So I think this has held up actually very well, and now that the price, again, of the KEYone has dropped significantly on the third-party marketplace, makes it an excellent value to consider versus some of those other newer minimalist style phones. So you can check out more details if you are interested in something like this in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a kind of nostalgic look back at one of the last Android-powered BlackBerry devices released on the market, the BlackBerry KEYone.